When I saw her standing there, I didn't see a beggar. I didn't see a girl looking for a handout. I saw a mirror. And for the first time in 20 years, I didn't like what was looking back at me. Most people come into my office and they start talking before the door even clicks shut. They sweat. They stutter. They try to sell me a version of themselves that doesn't exist. But Mimi, she didn't say a word. She just stood there in that damp denim jacket, the smell of the New Jersey rain clinging to her hair like a second skin. She held that piece of cardboard like it was a shield, or maybe a tombstone. I am mute, it said. A lie, maybe. Or maybe just a truth she hadn't found the breath for yet. I looked at her and I didn't see a beggar. I saw a mirror. I saw the same hollowed-out look I see in my own reflection when the lights are too bright and the room is too quiet. Most guys in my position would have thrown a $100 bill at her just to make the guilt go away. But I didn't want her to go away. I wanted to know why the world had decided to break someone who looked like they hadn't even had a chance to bend yet. My name is Vesant Han. People in this neighborhood call me a lot of things. None of them are particularly kind and most of them are true. I deal in debts. I deal in the things people do when they're desperate. My office is on the 40th floor, all glass and cold stone, designed to make people feel small. But Mimi, she didn't look small. She looked heavy. Like she was carrying the weight of that sick mother of hers, Esther, right there on her shoulders. Hello, family. This isn't the right time to skip. Stay glued, hit the subscribe button, and also drop your city in the comments, so I will know where you are watching from. So I can specially send you regards. Now let's get to the root. I watched her through the security feed after I told her to wait. She didn't fidget. She didn't look at the expensive art on the walls. She just stared at her own reflection in the window, her hands gripping that cardboard so hard her knuckles were turning white. I realized then that she wasn't there for a job. Not really. She was there for a miracle, and I've never been a saint, God knows that. But I'm a man who knows how to fix things that are broken. I decided right then, as the rain turned into a downpour against the glass, that I wasn't going to give her a job. I was going to give her a foundation, and I was going to make sure that whatever monsters were chasing her, well, they'd have to go through me first. I've spent 20 years reading people like they're open books, usually books written in blood and bad intentions. But Mimi, she was a blank page, a page someone had tried to rip out and crumble up. When I stood up from my desk, the silence in the room changed. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of a threat. It was the kind of silence you find in a church after everyone has left. "You're not mute," I said, my voice barely a whisper against the hum of the air conditioning. I didn't say it to be mean. I said it because I knew. I knew the difference between someone who can't speak and someone who's forgotten how. She didn't flinch. She just looked at me. And for a second, I felt like she was the one sitting behind the big mahogany desk, and I was the one begging for a life. I walked around the desk. Most people back away when I get close. They know about the ink on my neck. They know what the Han name means in this city, but she stayed rooted. Her boots were worn through at the soles, caked in the gray slush of the Jersey streets. She was shaking, but it wasn't fear. It was exhaustion, the kind that gets into your bones and stays there. "Who told you to come here?" I asked. She didn't reach for her sign this time. She just pointed toward the window, toward the sprawl of the city below us, toward the tenements where the heat doesn't work and the sirens never stop. She wasn't pointing at a person. She was pointing at the world. She was saying that the world sent her, because where else do you go when you're at the end of the rope? You go to the man who owns the rope. I looked at the sign again. My mom is sick and old. I've seen 1,000 sob stories. I've had gays cry on my floor over gambling debts while their wives waited in the car. I've had mothers beg for their sons' lives. I'm numb to it, or I thought I was. But there was something about the way she held that cardboard, like it was the only thing keeping her from floating away into the gray sky outside. "I don't have jobs for girls who don't speak," I said, testing her. It was a cruel thing to say, but I needed to see if there was any fight left in her. This is a business of words, negotiations, threats, promises. What can you do for me? She did something then that I'll never forget. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, crushed flower, a marigold, probably picked from a crack in the sidewalk. She laid it on my desk. It was bright orange against the dark wood, a tiny, defiant splash of color in my sterile, gray world. Then she looked me dead in the eye and touched her heart. Then she pointed at mine. She wasn't begging for a job. She was offering a trade, her spirit for my protection. "Wait here," I said. I walked out to the lobby and signaled to my driver, Cale. He's been with me since the beginning. He saw the look on my face and reached for his keys. He didn't ask questions. He knows that when I get that specific shadow in my eyes, something is about to change. "We're going to the west side," I told him. "Find out where she lives, and Cale, bring the medic, the quiet one." I went back into the office. Mimi was still standing there. She hadn't touched a thing. She hadn't even sat down. "Let's go," I said, picking up my coat. "Show me Esther." She didn't move at first. She just stared at me, her eyes searching for the hidden motive. She was looking for the trap. She spent her whole life waiting for the other shoe to drop, and here I was, the man who owned the shoes, offering her a way out. "The rain isn't getting any lighter, Mimi," I said, opening the door. "And neither is your mother's breath. Let's move." As we walked toward the elevator, the staff stopped and stared. They'd seen me walk out with models, with politicians, with killers. They'd never seen me walk out with a girl in a wet denim jacket who looked like she carried the soul of the neighborhood in her pocket. I pushed the button for the garage. As the doors closed, I saw her reflection in the polished brass. She looked like she was finally letting go of a breath she'd been holding for 10 years. "Don't get comfortable," I muttered, mostly to myself. "I'm still a monster." But she just looked at me, and for the first time, I think I saw her almost smile. "Vesant says he's still a monster, but he's already stepping up to help. Do you think a man like Vesant can truly change, or is he just trading one kind of power for another? Drop a protect in the comments if you think Mimi was right to trust him." The drive to the west side was silent, the kind of silence that rings in your ears. I watched the city lights blur against the rain-streaked window of the SUV, thinking about how many times I'd driven these streets to break a man's spirit, and how strange it felt to be driving them to save one. Cale kept his eyes on the road, but I could see him checking the rearview mirror, looking at Mimi. She was sitting on the edge of the leather seat, her hands folded in her lap, watching the skyscrapers disappear as we headed into the gut of the city. When we pulled up to her building, I felt a familiar coldness settle in my gut. It was a tenement, the kind where the bricks look like they're held together by nothing but dampness and old grease. The streetlights were out, smashed by kids or just neglected by a city that had forgotten this block existed. "Wait here," I told Cale, "and keep the engine running." I followed Mimi up. The stairs didn't just creak, they groaned. A hollow, rhythmic sound that felt like the building was breathing its last. The smell hit me on the second landing, musty wood, stale cabbage, and the sharp, chemical tang of cheap disinfectant. This was the world Mimi lived in, a world where you had to fight for the very air you breathed. She stopped at 4B. The door didn't even have a proper deadbolt, just a flimsy latch that wouldn't have stopped a stiff breeze, let alone the kind of men who prowl these hallways. She pushed it open and stepped aside. It was one room, one window that didn't close all the way, letting in a thin, shivering draft, and there was Esther. I've seen death before. I've seen men gasp their last in the dirt, but this was different. This was a slow fatting. Esther was propped up on a pile of thin pillows, her skin the color of a winter sky just before the sun goes down. She looked like she was made of glass, like one loud noise would shatter her. When her eyes drifted to me, they didn't show fear. They showed a tired, ancient kind of relief. She knew her daughter had finally brought home the solution. "We're leaving," I said. I didn't wait for her to agree. I didn't ask if they had belongings to pack. Looking around that room, there was nothing worth saving except the two women in it. Mimi moved to the bed, her hands fluttering over her mother like a bird's wings. She started gathering a few tattered blankets, but I stepped forward and caught her wrist. Her skin was ice cold. "Leave it," I said, my voice grating like gravel. "Everything here. Let the rot have it. You're going to a place where the sheets don't smell like the street." I reached down and scooped Esther up. She weighed nothing, less than the stacks of cash I keep in my office safe. It made my chest tight, a sensation I wasn't used to. I'm a man of iron and ink, but carrying that woman down those stairs felt like carrying a miracle I wasn't allowed to drop. By the time we got back to the SUV, Cale had the door open. He didn't say a word as I settled Esther into the back seat, Mimi sliding in right beside her. We drove uptown, to a building I own that doesn't officially exist on any public record. The janitor move. I call it that because when I'm done, it's like the past was never there. The apartment was on the 12th floor, high enough to be safe, low enough to feel grounded. When I opened the door, the warmth hit us first. The radiator was humming, a steady golden heat that filled the room. The floors were polished oak. The bed in the corner was hospital-grade but covered in soft, white linens. I watched Mimi walk into the center of the room. She stood there for a long time, just looking at the light fixtures. Then she reached out and touched the wall, like she was making sure it was real. "The doctor will be here in an hour," I told her, leaning against the doorframe. "There's food in the kitchen, clothes in the closet that will actually fit you." Mimi turned to me. She didn't have her sign anymore. She just looked at me. And then she did something that caught me off guard. She walked over and touched the tattoo on my hand, the one of the black scales. She looked up at me, her eyes searching mine, and for a second, I felt seen. Not as a boss, not as a monster, but as a man. "Don't thank me," I muttered, pulling my hand away. "I'm just protecting my investment." But as I walked out and heard the heavy click of the deadbolt, a real, solid lock, I knew I was lying to myself. I sat in the kitchen of the safe house, the air smelling of new paint and expensive floor wax. It was a stark contrast to the rot of the West Side. I was nursing a glass of bourbon, not because I wanted to get drunk, but because I needed something to bite back against the sudden, hollow feeling in my chest. In the next room, I could hear the muffled, rhythmic beep of a heart monitor and the low, clinical murmur of Dr. Aris. Aris was the kind of doctor who didn't exist on paper. He was a genius who had lost his license years ago for doing favors for men like me. But his hands were still the steadiest in the tri-state area. He didn't ask questions. He didn't call the authorities. He just took the cash and kept his mouth shut. Mimi came out of the bedroom. She had changed into one of the soft, oversized sweaters I'd had Cale pick up. It swallowed her small frame, making her look even younger, even more out of place in my world of sharp edges. She didn't sit down. She just stood by the counter, watching the closed door where her mother lay. "He's good, Mimi," I said, swirling the amber liquid in my glass. "The best money can buy. If there's a way to pull her back, he'll find it." She looked at me, her eyes tracking the movement of the glass. She walked over, pulled a chair out with a quiet scrape, and sat across from me. She didn't have her cardboard sign anymore. She didn't need it. The way she leaned forward, her chin resting on her hand, told me everything. She was waiting, not just for her mother, but for me to tell her what the catch was. "You're wondering what I want," I said, voice flat. I set the glass down with a heavy thud. "In my world, nothing is free. You're waiting for the bill." She didn't blink. She just kept that steady, soul-piercing gaze on me. It was unnerving. I'm used to people flinching when I speak. I'm used to them looking at the floor, but Mimi looked at me like she could see the boy I was before the streets turned me into a ghost. "The bill is simple," I continued, leaning in. "You stay here, you take care of her, and you don't talk to anyone, not the delivery guy, not the person in the hallway, to the rest of the world. You and Esther died in that tenement fire last night." I watched her process that. I was giving her a life, but I was also giving her a cage. A gilded one, sure, but a cage nonetheless. She slowly nodded. She understood the trade, her freedom for her mother's breath. The door opened and Aris stepped out, snapping off his latex gloves. He looked at me, then at Mimi, his expression unreadable. "She's stable, Vesant," Aris said, wiping his brow. "Severe respiratory distress, malnutrition, the works, but the lungs are holding. She needs the high-flow oxygen for at least a month, and she needs peace. No stress, no moving." I felt a weight lift, just a fraction. I stood up and handed Aris a thick envelope. He tucked it into his bag without looking inside. "I'll be back in 2 days," he said, heading for the door. "Make sure she eats, high protein." As the door clicked shut, my phone vibrated in my pocket. It was a text from one of my captains, a man named Jung who had a habit of sniffing out things that weren't his business. The West Side crew is asking about 4B. They say a ghost moved out before the fire started. Word is getting around, boss. People are curious. I gripped the phone until my knuckles turned white. The sharks were already circling. They didn't care about a sick woman and her daughter. They cared about why I cared. In my business, curiosity is a death sentence. I looked at Mimi. She was watching me, her brow furrowed. She knew the vibration of that phone meant trouble. I realized then that by pulling them out of the dark, I had dragged a target onto their backs. My protection was a shield, but it was also a flare in the night. "Get some sleep, Mimi," I said, grabbing my coat. My voice was harsher than I intended. I have to go handle a curiosity problem. I walked toward the door, but before I could leave, I felt a small, firm hand catch the sleeve of my jacket. I stopped. I didn't turn around. "Don't," I whispered. "I told you, I'm not the hero in this story." I pulled away and stepped out into the cold hallway, the silence of the apartment following me like a ghost. I had to make sure Jung and everyone else knew that Mimi and Esther didn't exist. And I had to do it before the world found out I had a heart left to break. Vesant is trying to erase Mimi's past to keep her safe, but his own crew is already getting suspicious. Do you think he can keep them hidden forever? A month passed and the apartment started to feel less like a safe house and more like, well, a home. That's a dangerous word for a man like me. I'd spent 30 years avoiding anything that couldn't be packed into a suitcase in 5 minutes, but Esther was sitting up now. Her color had returned, a soft warmth that replaced that deathly gray. And Mimi was the one I couldn't stop watching. She was like a plant that had been kept in a cellar and finally moved to the window, but she was restless. I'd catch her staring at the door, her hands constantly moving, twisting a piece of string or folding a napkin into a perfect bird. She didn't want a handout, she wanted a purpose. I decided to give her one. I drove her to a corner on 5th Street. It was an old brick storefront with high ceilings and floor-to-ceiling glass. It used to be a pawn shop, a place where people traded their memories for rent money. I'd spent the last week having my cleaners gut the place. Now it smelled like cedar and fresh water. "Get out," I said, killing the engine. Mimi looked at the shop, then back at me, her brow furrowing. I walked to the door and turned the key. The bell above the door gave a soft, silver chime. I pushed it open and stepped aside. "Flowers don't ask questions, Mimi," I said, leaning against the doorframe. "And they don't care if you don't talk. They just grow. You take care of them. They'll take care of you." I watched her walk into the space. The light hit her, making the gold hoops in her ears glimmer. She walked to the back, where a large refrigeration unit was already humming, filled with lilies, roses, and the bright orange marigolds she'd once left on my desk. She touched a petal with a delicacy that made my chest ache. She wasn't just a girl in a denim jacket anymore. She was an artist. "It's yours," I said. "Paperwork is in the drawer. The lease is paid for 10 years. The taxes. Don't worry about the taxes. I've made sure the city thinks this building is a non-profit annex." She turned around, her eyes wide. She walked toward me, stopping just a few inches away. I could see the flecks of amber in her eyes. She didn't speak, but her presence was louder than any shout. She reached out and grabbed my hand, the one with the scars across the knuckles. She squeezed it, hard. "Don't," I muttered, but I didn't pull away this time. "It's a business arrangement. You keep the neighborhood looking good. I keep the neighborhood quiet." But the quiet was already breaking. My phone buzzed. It was Jung. He didn't text this time, he called. I stepped out onto the sidewalk, leaving Mimi with her flowers. "Boss," Jung's voice was tight. "We have a problem. Varro found out about the shop. He's been asking why the Mafia prince is spending his afternoons at a florist. He thinks you've lost your edge. He thinks you're building a nest." I looked through the glass. Mimi was holding a bunch of white hydrangeas, her face peaceful for the first time in her life. Varro was a vulture. He didn't have a code, he just had an appetite. If he thought I was soft, he wouldn't just go after my territory. He'd go after the reason for the softness. Tell Varro to mind his own table, I said, my voice dropping an octave. And Jung, if I see a single car I don't recognize on this block, it's not going to be a conversation. It's going to be a funeral. Understood, Jung whispered. But boss, the guys are talking. They say you're protecting a ghost and a girl who won't even say thank you. It makes us look different. Different is dangerous, Jung, I said, looking at my reflection in the glass. But so am I. I hung up. I looked back inside. Mimi was looking at me. She knew. She didn't know the names or the politics, but she knew the shadow had returned to my face. She walked to the door and held out a single rose, red, the color of blood, and the color of warning. I took it. The thorn pricked my thumb, a tiny drop of red blooming against my skin. I didn't flinch. Go back inside, Mimi, I said, my heart turning back into the stone it was meant to be. Close the curtains, lock the door. I'll be back when the street is clean. I got into the SUV and drove away, the rose sitting on the dashboard like a promise I wasn't sure I could keep without burning the world down. The flowers didn't just survive, they thrived. Within weeks, Mimi's shop, the Silent Petal, had become a strange anomaly on 5th Street. It was a pocket of grace in a neighborhood that usually smelled of wet pavement and broken promises. I spent most of my mornings in the black SUV parked across the street, a ghost behind tinted glass. I watched the way she worked. She didn't use a cash register. She used a small box and a ledger, writing prices down for people who didn't know how to handle her quiet. But the world I live in, it doesn't let beauty sit still for long. It wants to stain it. It wants to see if the color rubs off. I saw them before Mimi did, a silver sedan that had circled the block 3 times. It didn't belong here. It was too clean, too loud. It pulled up to the curb and 2 of Varro's hitters stepped out. They weren't there to kill. Not yet. They were there to scout. They were testing the perimeter of my patience. I watched through the window as they walked into the shop. Mimi was at the back, trimming the stems of some eucalyptus. The bell chimed and I saw her shoulders stiffen. She knew. Even without looking up, she could feel the change in the air, the way the temperature drops when a predator enters a room. The taller one, a man with a scarred lip and eyes like flat stones, leaned over the counter. He picked up a delicate arrangement of white orchids and began to pull the petals off, one by one, letting them fall like snow onto the floor. I felt the pulse in my neck begin to thrum. My hand moved to the door handle, but I forced myself to wait. I needed to see what she would do. Mimi didn't retreat. She didn't drop her shears. She walked slowly toward the counter, her eyes fixed on his. She didn't look at the orchids he was destroying. She looked at him with a cold, terrifying stillness. She reached out, took a small chalkboard from the counter, and wrote 3 words in sharp, white chalk. Not for you. The hitter laughed, a harsh, grating sound. He reached over the counter to grab her chin, his fingers trailing toward her throat. Varro wants to know if you're as quiet in the dark as you are in the light, he sneered. I didn't think. I was out of the SUV before the door had even clicked. I didn't run. Running is for people who are afraid they'll miss their chance. I walked. When I stepped through that door, the bell didn't just chime. It felt like a warning. The 2 men spun around. Their hands went to their waistbands, but they stopped the moment they saw my face. In this city, you don't pull a weapon-on-vescent hand unless you've already made peace with your God. Boss, Scarlip stammered, his bravado leaking out of him like water from a cracked pipe. We were just looking for a gift for Varro. I walked past them, my eyes never leaving Mimi. She was standing perfectly still, her chest rising and falling in shallow, even breaths. I reached out and took the orchid from the man's hand. I looked at the mangled petals. Varro has expensive taste, I said, my voice so low it was almost a hum. But he's forgotten one thing. In this shop, I'm the only one who gets to decide what's for sale. I turned to the hitters. I didn't yell. I didn't even raise my hand. I just looked at them with the weight of 20 years of violence behind my eyes. Go back to your master. Tell him that if I see a silver sedan on this block again, I won't send him flowers. I'll send him the engine block, with your hearts inside it. They didn't wait for a second invitation. They scrambled out, the tires of the silver sedan shrieking as they fled. The shop went quiet again. The smell of eucalyptus was heavy, sweet, and sharp. I looked at Mimi. She was looking at the orchid in my hand. Then she looked at the drop of blood on my thumb where the rose from yesterday had pricked me. She reached across the counter and took my hand. She didn't say thank you. She just held it, her skin warm against my cold, scarred knuckles. "They'll be back, Mimi," I whispered, the weight of the crown I wore feeling heavier than ever. "The shadow doesn't just go away because you turn on a light." She picked up her chalk and wiped the board clean. She wrote, "I am not afraid of the dark." I looked at those words. She was braver than the men who worked for me. She was braver than I was, but bravery doesn't stop a bullet. "You should be," I said, pulling my hand away, "because the dark is where I live." The air in the city was changing, becoming heavy with the scent of ozone and wet asphalt. I knew the storm was coming, but I didn't expect it to sit at my table. I had called a sit-down at a small, dimly lit restaurant on the edge of the iron-bound district. It was neutral ground, or as neutral as any place can be when you're surrounded by men who measure loyalty in dollars and degrees of fear. Varro was already there, picking at a plate of cold antipasto with a silver fork. He looked up as I entered, his smile thin and oily, like a spill on a rainy street. To my left sat Jung, my captain, his face a mask of uneasy silence. The atmosphere was thick, vibrating with the unspoken. "Vesant," Varro purred, gesturing to the seat across from him. "You're late. I was beginning to think you traded your watch for a bouquet of lilies." I sat down, my movements slow and deliberate. I didn't reach for the wine. I didn't reach for the bread. I just rested my hands on the table, the black scales of my tattoo catching the dim light of the chandelier. "Let's skip the poetry, Varro. You sent men into a shop that carries my mark. That's not scouting. That's an insult." Varro laughed, a wet, rattling sound. "An insult? No, no. It was a concern. We're partners, Vesant. And when a partner starts spending his nights playing guardian angel to a girl who can't even tell him his suit is out of style, well, it makes the rest of us wonder if the sword has gone blunt." I felt Jung shift beside me. He didn't speak, but I could feel his doubt. My own men were watching me, waiting to see if I'd prioritize the business or the ghost I'd pulled from the tenements. "The sword is as sharp as it's ever been," I said, my voice dropping to a register that made the waiter stop mid-stride across the room. "The girl and her mother are established. They are not part of the ledger. They are off-limits." "Permanently." Varro leaned in, his eyes narrowing. "Nothing is off-limits in this life, Vesant, not even family, especially not a family you chose. If she's so important to you, then she's important to the business. I want 20% of the shop's revenue as a security tax to ensure my boys don't get clumsy around her windows." The silence that followed was absolute. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I could hear the rain starting to tap against the glass outside. It was a shakedown. Varro wasn't looking for money. He was looking for a leash. He wanted to see if I'd let him put a price tag on Mimi's safety. "The shop doesn't make enough to pay your bar tab, Varro," I said quietly. "It's not about the money," Varro countered, his voice sharpening. "It's about the precedent. You protect a civilian, you pay the tax. That's the code. Or are you telling me you're above the code now? Are you telling Jung and the boys that a girl from the West Side is more important than the Brotherhood?" I looked at Jung. His eyes were hard. He was a good soldier, but he lived by the rules of the street. If I said no, I was choosing a stranger over the organization. If I said yes, I was letting Varro's shadow fall over Mimi's flowers. "I'll give you an answer by sunrise," I said, standing up. Varro grinned, thinking he'd won. "Don't take too long, Vesant. Sunlight has a way of revealing things we'd rather keep hidden." I walked out into the rain, the cold water soaking into my wool coat instantly. I didn't go to my office. I didn't go to my penthouse. I drove back to the shop. It was closed, but the lights in the back were still on. I sat in the SUV, watching Mimi through the glass. She was sitting at a small table, her head bowed over a book, a single lamp casting a warm, amber glow around her. She looked so peaceful, so distant from the wolves I'd just been dining with. I realized then that there was no middle ground. I couldn't be her protector and a brother to men like Varro at the same time. One of those worlds had to die so the other could live. I reached into my glove box and pulled out my piece. I checked the clip. The metal felt cold, honest. I wasn't going to pay a tax. I was going to pay a debt. The thing about men like Varro is that they don't wait for an answer. They take it from the air. By 3 in the morning, the rain had turned into a thick, suffocating fog that swallowed the streetlights. I was sitting in my kitchen, the silence of the penthouse feeling like a physical weight, when my phone screamed on the marble counter. It was Young. It was the emergency line I'd installed in Mimi's apartment. I didn't even breathe as I picked it up. There was no voice on the other end. Mimi couldn't give me one, but I heard the sound of glass shattering, and then the heavy, wet cough of Esther. It was a sound that made my blood turn to liquid nitrogen. "Mimi," I barked into the receiver. Nothing but a sharp, rhythmic tapping on the phone's mouthpiece. 3 taps, our code for danger. Then the line went dead. I didn't call for backup. I didn't call Kale. I grabbed my keys and my jacket, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped animal. I drove through the city like a man possessed, ignoring red lights and the slick patches of oil on the asphalt. My mind was a blur of images. Esther's frail frame, Mimi's quiet, terrified eyes, the smell of the lilies in her shop being crushed under a boot. When I reached the apartment, the front door to the building was hanging off its hinges. The lock I'd boasted about, the one I said was a wall, had been bypassed with a professional touch. I didn't take the elevator. I hit the stairs 3 at a time, my lungs burning, the taste of copper in my mouth. I burst into the apartment, my weapon drawn, but the room was empty. The oxygen concentrator was knocked over, its steady hum replaced by a frantic, high-pitched alarm. The white sheets on the bed were torn, and on the floor, scattered like broken promises, were the white hydrangeas Mimi had brought home that afternoon. Then I saw it. Tacked to the wall with a kitchen knife was a note. No signature, just a time and an address. 4:00 a.m. The docks. Bring the ledger, Vesant, or bring 2 caskets. I sank onto the edge of the bed, the reality hitting me like a physical blow. Varro hadn't just attacked my business. He'd reached into the one clean place left in my soul and tried to set it on fire. He'd taken Esther, a woman who could barely walk across a room without catching her breath. I looked at the floor and saw a small, glinting object. I picked it up. It was Mimi's gold hoop earring. It was bent, crushed. I realized then that I had been a fool. I thought I could build a garden in a graveyard and expect the ghosts not to notice. I thought I could be a protector without being an executioner. I stood up, the fear leaving me, replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity. Varro thought he'd found my weakness. He thought Esther and Mimi were the weights that would pull me down. He didn't understand. They weren't my weakness. They were my permission. For 20 years, I'd held back the worst parts of myself to keep the business running. But now, the business didn't matter. The code didn't matter. I walked to the closet and pulled out a heavy duffel bag I hadn't opened since the war for the North Side. I didn't need a ledger. I didn't need a negotiation. I needed to remind this city why the name Han is whispered in the dark. I looked at the bent earring in my palm one last time. "Hold on, Mimi," I whispered to the empty room. "I'm coming, and I'm bringing the hell they've been asking for." Varro has crossed the ultimate line by kidnapping a sick woman and her daughter. Vesant is going in alone, and he's not planning on talking. Do you think he's going on a suicide mission, or is Varro about to find out exactly why you never poke a sleeping lion? Comment justice if you're ready for the takedown, or hope if you're praying Mimi and Esther make it out alive. The docks at 4:00 a.m. are a graveyard of rusted shipping containers and the smell of salt and diesel, a place where things go to be forgotten. The fog was so thick I could barely see the hood of the SUV. I killed the headlights a block away and let the car coast to a stop. The silence was absolute, broken only by the distant, rhythmic slap of the tide against the pier. I stepped out, the weight of the duffel bag slung over my shoulder. My heart wasn't racing. It had slowed down, becoming a steady, heavy thud that matched the gravity of what I was about to do. Varro thought he was luring me into a trap. He thought I was coming to trade. He didn't realize that when you take the only light in a man's life, you leave him perfectly comfortable in the dark. I moved through the shadows of Warehouse 17 like a ghost. I didn't need to be loud. I needed to be final. I saw them through a cracked window. Varro was sitting on a crate, smoking a cigar, the red ember glowing like a malicious eye. Two of his men were standing by the door, and there, in the center of the room, was Mimi. She was sitting on a cold concrete floor, her back against a rusted pole. She wasn't crying. She was just staring at Varro with that same unbreakable stillness I'd seen in my office. But it was Esther who made my grip tighten on the steel in my hand. She was slumped in a chair, her portable oxygen tank lying on its side, the tube tangled. Her chest was barely moving. She was drowning in the open air, and Varro was just watching the clock. I didn't wait for a signal. I didn't call out a warning. I entered through the loading bay. The first man didn't even have time to reach for his belt. I handled it quietly, a swift, clinical strike that sent him to the floor before he could make a sound. The second one turned, eyes widening, but I was already there. I wasn't the Mafia boss in that moment. I was the wall I'd promised Mimi I would be. Varro jumped up, his cigar falling to the floor. "Vesant, you were supposed to bring the ledger," he shouted, his voice cracking as he scrambled for the weapon tucked into his waistband. I stepped into the light, my face a mask of cold, pale fury. I didn't look at him, I looked at Mimi. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second, and I saw it. Not fear, not a plea, just a quiet, terrifying trust. "The ledger is closed, Varro," I said, my voice echoing off the corrugated metal walls. Varro pulled his piece, but he was shaking. He knew. He looked at the shadows behind me, expecting an army, but there was no one, just me, just the man he thought he'd broken. "You're crazy," Varro hissed, backing away toward the pier. "You'd kill us all for what? A girl who can't even say your name, a woman who's already dead." I didn't answer with words. I moved with a speed that comes from having nothing left to lose. I didn't use a gun. I didn't want the noise to wake the city. I wanted Varro to feel the weight of every orchid he'd crushed, every breath Esther had struggled to take. I caught him by the throat, pinning him against the cold, damp wall of the warehouse. He clawed at my hands, his face turning a mottled purple. She's just a civilian," he wheezed. "She's my family," I whispered into his ear. "And you're just a debt that's finally come due." I didn't kill him. Death would have been too quick, too easy for a man like Varro. I made sure he would never be able to hold a weapon, or a cigar, or a conversation again. I broke the man, piece by piece, until he was nothing but a heap of expensive silk and wasted ambition on the concrete floor. I turned away from the wreckage and ran to Esther. I picked up the oxygen tank, cleared the line, and placed the mask over her face. I watched her chest, waiting, praying to a god I hadn't spoken to in decades. One breath, too. Her eyes fluttered open. She looked at me, then at Mimi. Mimi was on her feet now. She walked over and knelt beside us. She didn't look at Varro. She didn't look at the blood on my cuffs. She just reached out and touched my cheek. Her hand trembling, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of the silence being lifted. "It's over," I said, my voice breaking for the first time. "I've got you. I've got both of you." I picked Esther up, and for the second time she felt like a miracle in my arms. As we walked out of that warehouse and into the gray light of dawn, the fog was finally starting to lift. The city was waking up, oblivious to the fact that a war had ended in the dark. I was still the monster. My hands were still stained, but as Mimi walked beside me, her shoulder brushing against mine, I knew the shadow wasn't following us anymore. It was protecting us. Vesant chose Mimi over the code, and he took down Varro with his own hands. But in this world, there are always more wolves. Do you think Vesant can ever truly walk away from his life, or is he destined to be their protector forever? Comment forever if you think this is his new life, or freedom if you want to see them all escape the city for good. The aftermath of a storm isn't usually loud. It's quiet, a heavy, ringing quiet that sits in your marrow. In the weeks that followed the night at the docks, the city's underworld went silent. Varro was gone, and the rest of the wolves, well, They saw what happens when you try to hunt in my backyard. They learned that there is a difference between a businessman and a man who has found a reason to breathe. I didn't go back to the 40th floor right away. I spent my time in the shadows of the shop or sitting on the bench in the small community garden I'd bought for the block. I watched Esther. She was sitting in the sun now, a thick wool blanket over her knees, her eyes bright and clear. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living. And Mimi had changed. The denim jacket was gone, replaced by an apron stained with the green of stems and the bright dust of pollen. She didn't look like a girl waiting for the world to end. She looked like the one who decided when the day began. I was leaning against the brick wall of the alleyway, watching the evening light turn the shop's windows into gold. I didn't go inside. I never did. I knew my place. I was the lock on the door, the iron in the gate. I wasn't meant for the warmth inside. I was built to make sure the warmth stayed where it belonged. Mimi walked out of the back door carrying a crate of discarded leaves. She saw me. She always saw me. She set the crate down and walked over, wiping her hands on her apron. She stopped a few feet away, her eyes searching mine, looking for the ghosts of the docks. "The shop is doing well," I said, my voice sounding rough even to me. "I heard you're providing the arrangements for the new library downtown. That's good, Mimi. You're established now. You don't need me to watch the street every morning." I meant it as a release. I was giving her the chance to walk away from the shadow, to find a life that didn't involve a man with ink on his neck and blood in his history. I started to turn away, pulling my collar up against the evening chill. "Vasant." I froze. The sound was small, like a first breath, like a secret whispered in a cathedral. I turned back, my heart doing something it hadn't done in 30 years. Mimi was standing there, her lips still parted, her eyes wet with a sudden, fierce light. She had spoken. She had found her voice in the one place I never expected her to use it, on me. "Vasant," she said again, clearer this time. It wasn't a cry for help. It wasn't a plea. It was a name, my name. She walked toward me, stooping so close I could smell the lilies and the rain. "Stay." I looked down at her. I didn't see a debt. I didn't see a mute girl. I saw a woman who had seen the worst of me and decided it was worth keeping. I didn't take her hand. I didn't kiss her. That wasn't our story. I was a protector, and for the first time in my life, that was enough. Mimi finally spoke his name, and the silence was broken. This is the end of their first chapter, but the beginning of their shared future. What did this story teach you about loyalty and family? Drop "I love this story" in the comments if this ending touched your heart, and subscribe for more stories of grit, protection, and the silent bonds that save us all.